Michael Saylor, welcome back to the show.
Happy to be here.
It is very good to have you. Now, at the time of recording, Bitcoin is over 100K and has been for quite a while at this point. So I think the question of is Bitcoin real is dead. But now the question becomes, how does Bitcoin go from where we're at a little over 100K to the 13 million a coin that you consider the base case?
Yeah, I think I've always said it's either something or it's nothing. If it's embraced as an institutional asset, if it's legitimized as an asset, then it's not going to zero. And if it's not going to zero, it's going to a million. And I think the short answer to your question is education. And with education comes adoption. And at this point, you just have 95% of the world that still doesn't quite understand what it is. And that means, I mean, the way Bitcoin marches from 100,000 to 13 million, and by that's for your listeners, you're referring to my long-term forecast. I gave that forecast in Nashville in July of this year. And it's based upon the Bitcoin 24 model. So the Bitcoin 24 model is an open source macro model of Bitcoin adoption and macroeconomic development over the next 21 years. Anybody can go to Google and they can Google Bitcoin 24. They'll find it on GitHub. You can download that model. You can plug in all your own assumptions and you can check what we thought. But my forecast is Bitcoin, in essence, it's growing 60% a year for quite a while now. And I'm forecasting it will decelerate to 20% a year over 21 years. But that means on average, it grows about 29% a year, ARR. And that 29% a year for 21 years gets you to 13 million a coin. And so what do I expect to happen? Well, I expect lots of high net worth individuals that previously thought it's too risky or it's too scary. They see it legitimized by BlackRock. Now, BlackRock is giving guidance that you could have 2% of your portfolio in Bitcoin. And they're seeing the ETFs like IBIT. And they're noticing that these are the most successful ETFs in the history of the world. And BlackRock has got the most successful ETF ever launched. And now they're seeing the world's largest money manager, BlackRock, with more than $11 trillion of money managed. They're seeing them publish scholarly, thoughtful, responsible white papers on portfolio allocation. And instead of the 60-40 model with 60% equity and 40% bonds, now you've got 2% that they're saying you might want to put into a crypto asset like Bitcoin. So I think that you've got that group of people that are finding it. I also think you've got institutional investors that are moving into Bitcoin more frequently now. A lot of them are big investors in MicroStrategy. A lot of them trade MicroStrategy options. MicroStrategy has been the most successful stock in the S&P index. We're not in the S&P, but we're more successful than all 500 S&P companies for the past 4 years. I think this year too. So we're getting the attention of mainstream investors. And that's bringing a set of new investors to the asset class because when they buy our stock, we buy Bitcoin with it. I think the third driver is a bunch of Bitcoin standard companies. A lot of companies are recapitalizing their balance sheets on Bitcoin. MicroStrategy was the first, but Mara has done it, M-A-R-A, and Riot just announced they're doing it, R-I-O-T. And the most successful company in the Japanese stock market this year is Metaplanet, and they just did it. And Similar Scientific just did it, and they tripled their stock in very short order. So you've got like a half dozen companies that are recapitalizing to the Bitcoin standard, but you've got 60 companies that have Bitcoin, and there's a lot of companies that are getting more heavily involved. I think recently Hut 8 announced, Hut, H-U-T, and then Rumble, R-U-M, And so a bunch of public companies that are kind of, they're innovators, and they've got a fairly open mind, and they're flexible. And the really important thing about that, Tom, is when a public company adopts Bitcoin, they start sweeping their cash flows into it. But then after that, they may start issuing equity. And then after that, they can borrow money. So Riot just this week issued a $500 million convertible bond, and then they bought Bitcoin with it. And
Is
Mara,
this Riot Games?
no, Riot Bitcoin mining,
Got it.
RIOT, Riot. And so Mara did the same thing. They did a $1 billion convertible bond deal, and they bought Bitcoin. And then they did another $850 million bond deal 2 weeks later. And MicroStrategy, when we announced we were going to pursue a Bitcoin treasury company model, we announced that October 30th of just this year. And we've raised, something in the range of $15 billion in the last 6 weeks. And so you're talking about large sums of money that are flowing. I mean, much larger sums. It took us 30 years to accumulate $500 million in order to buy Bitcoin in 2020. It took us 4 years to accumulate $10 billion. And we bought Bitcoin over the next 4 years. But then it took us like 4 weeks or 5 weeks to accumulate the next 15 billion. So you would check off that box, which is company adoption. Then after that, you've got like institutional adoption, the endowments and the pension funds. There's now pension funds that are starting to allocate to Bitcoin, and there'll be big university endowments and 501c3s and insurance companies. And so that's another driver. And then you've got nation states. And of course, the news of the week is the United States Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. And the US already has about 1% of the Bitcoin. If they don't sell it, that's a big deal. And Donald Trump said, never sell your Bitcoin. And then he was elected president. But now you have Senator Cynthia Lummis advocating for a US